Letter 3. On infantilization. When he arrived in New York on August 29, 1909, while they were on the deck of the ship and the city was in sight, Freud said to Jung, who was accompanying him, "They don't know we're bringing them the plague." He had no idea how right he was. What did he mean? We can't assume he was joking. Humor is not Freud's main character trait. In jokes and their relation to the unconscious, he presents a hypothesis about the mechanism of laughter. Unsurprisingly, it's sexual because for Freud, everything, absolutely everything, comes down to sex. Let's rather suppose that he imagined that, in a puritanical country like this one, his theories would wreak havoc like the plague on a continent. He came to ravage the Protestant ideology of the New World. He would succeed beyond his wildest hopes, for this illness would cover the entire Western world. We still live under this plague-ridden regime. But let's start at the beginning. What is psychoanalysis? At the end of the 19th century, in Vienna, Austria, a handful of individuals created this new discipline. Among them, a certain Sigmund Freud. Joseph Breuer developed a method that Freud would say in the history of the psychoanalytic movement, 1904, made him the inventor of psychoanalysis, only to later regret this statement and later assert in an autobiographical study, 1925, that in the end, no, he himself was indeed the inventor. This about-face shows that Freud was firmly set on erasing the collective genealogy of psychoanalysis in order to claim, by means of a coup, that he and he alone had revealed this new continent. To this end, he compared himself to Christopher Columbus discovering America, on the pretext that he had demonstrated the existence of the unconscious. Freud had read Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. He was familiar with the former's theory of the will, and with the latter's will to power. And thus spoke Zarathustra. Nietzsche speaks of the body as a great reason, and of consciousness as being led by this great reason. Freud would say nothing different. What is the Freudian unconscious? Freud's unconscious, formally speaking, if one can say so, it is in the body, but outside the body, since it is not locatable anywhere within it, a metapsychic entity, therefore beyond the psychic, which is already a highly volatile ether. There is no possible localization for it, certainly not in the brain. Freud wrote that it was a metaphor, but very quickly transformed this postulate into a certainty, then into scientific truth. What do we find in this metapsychic unconscious devoid of any physical, anatomical, bodily, material reality, but which supposedly exists nonetheless? Memories of scenes going back to prehistory, preserved phylogenetically, that is, passed from one individual to another through the species, and which guide the life of each person. For example, in the time of primitive hordes, a few males dominated the females. The sons, united against the father, the dominant male of the primitive horde, sought to abolish this situation. To that end, they killed the father and ate his body in a cannibal feast. Realizing the enormity of their crime, the murderers invented law. Hence all social organization, moral restrictions, religious prohibitions, and societal taboos. Freud offers no evidence to support this account. He believes his word is enough. He operates on the performative plane. What he says is true simply because he said it. Thus, a fiction extrapolated by him becomes a truth presented as scientific and universal. Another example, during a night train journey, when as a child he was accompanied by his mother, Freud writes that he could not see his mother naked, which remains to be proven, but never will be. He adds that he could not desire her, which seems likely, but is no more demonstrable for that, and concludes that this is the case for all boys, which is utter nonsense. He specifies that anyone who claims this is nonsense proves it to be true through their pathological resistance to admitting it. To support this Baroque fiction, he uses the story of Oedipus as told by Sophocles. Oedipus learns from the oracle that he will kill his father and unite sexually with his mother. To avoid this tragedy, he flees. But later, he sleeps with his mother, unaware of who she is, and kills his father without knowing his identity either. For the tragedian, this story shows that one cannot escape fate. For Freud, it shows that a boy's fate is to desire to sleep with his mother and to kill his father. He thus theorizes an Oedipus complex that turns Freud's desire for his mother into a universal and scientific truth extrapolated to all men. Further examples. Freud claims that a stepson sexually desires his stepmother, that the first sexual act between a man and a woman was a rape, which all women have remembered ever since, and which would determine the violence of relations between the sexes, that prehistoric men urinated on fire to extinguish it, feeling as though they were peeing on phalluses, which was a form of homosexual competition, that all fathers raped their daughters in childhood, the famous seduction theory, that homosexuals are sick individuals whose libidinal development got stuck along the way, and many other scientific outbursts of the same kind. There is therefore, in everyone's unconscious, an incredible number of such memories which, according to Freud, determine daily behaviors: murder of the father, cannibal feast, Oedipus complex, primal rape, seduction theory, or urinating on embers. This memory requires no anatomical or physiological support, since it is metapsychological. In other words, made of the stuff of dreams with which we create gods and fictions, novels and fables, tales and legends. Freud equates this supposed discovery, that what rules within us is not consciousness but the unconscious, with that of heliocentrism by Galileo. The sun is at the center of our system, and the earth revolves around it. And evolution by Darwin. Man was not created by God, but is the product of the evolution of an ape. These, he tells us, are all narcissistic wounds inflicted upon man. He is no longer the center of the universe, no longer the pinnacle of creation, no longer master of himself. This unconscious, present nowhere but active everywhere, Freud tells us we can access through analysis, psychoanalysis. What is it to undergo psychoanalysis? It is to reactivate a method that already existed with the sophist Xenophon of Athens in the 5th century BCE. He claimed that by interpreting the dreams people told him, he could cure the dreamer of their existential suffering. In exchange for payment, of course. One can also undergo didactic analysis. In that case, one does not come because of suffering, although it serves as a good pretext to conceal the true reason for such suffering, but to learn how one functions in order to become a psychoanalyst oneself. The profession requires little more, experiencing discomfort and trying to get cured of it. Some people who are unwell believe that by treating others, they will feel better themselves. In Freud's Viennese office, the patient lies on a couch with a psychoanalyst seated behind. He speaks freely, without concern for coherence, morality, or meaning. The method is called free association. He tells about himself. Meanwhile, the psychoanalyst remains silent. He ends the session after an agreed time, collects the fee. Every missed appointment must still be paid for. The transaction is done in cash. Theoretically, so the patient becomes aware of what it costs him in both senses of the word. In practice, it is also a way to bypass the tax authorities, since this business proves very lucrative. Freud forbids any empathy with the patient. The analysis can last for many years, 1, 2 decades, or even more. In the technique of psychoanalysis, he explains that he sits behind the patient, out of sight so he can doze off. He believes that even if he sleeps, evenly suspended attention still allows the unconscious minds to communicate. On this couch, the patient recounts dreams, slips of the tongue, Freudian slips, forgotten words or names, calculation mistakes. Freud always ends up giving them a sexual explanation. Ultimately, whatever he calls psychopathology is explained by a repressed Oedipal desire. Freud offers an explanation for the origin of neuroses. In our unconscious, we have desires, some of which can be expressed and fulfilled. Once they pose no problem. However, we are also plagued by socially unacceptable desires, and thus unutterable ones. 2 hypotheses are then available for these desires. Either sublimation. The subject transforms the antisocial desire into something socially acceptable. This is the origin of a work of art. or repression. The desire does not pass the sensor's barrier, and, like a ball bouncing off a wall, it creates a neurosis. Freud claims that during psychoanalysis, he seeks the motive behind this repression that causes neurosis, and that naming it makes the associated suffering disappear. To become conscious is to be cured. But, unsurprisingly, all locks, no matter how complex or unique, are opened by the same key, the Oedipus complex. What is repressed in neuroses is the desire to sleep with the parent of the opposite sex, and to kill the one of the same sex. Once this is spoken, though it can take several years to discover, symptoms vanish like butterflies, and the patient miraculously regains their mental health. On paper, Freud recounts a number of psychoanalyses to demonstrate that his method is remarkable, that it heals and cures. Anna, the Rat Man, Lil Hans, the Wolf Man, President Schreiber. In great detail, Freud lays out the symptoms and their disappearance after many sessions. However, historians of psychoanalysis have shown that Freud lied his entire life. He invented cases with several patients, embellished them, falsified results, turned failures into successes, and concealed the many failures he knew about. Didn't he himself write to Ludwig Binswanger on May 28, 1911, that psychoanalysis is a cure of savages? In other words, a pointless activity. Though he managed to impose psychoanalysis throughout the Western world and ended his life with a mouth cancer that caused him terrible suffering, he finally became sincere. At death's door, lying serves no purpose. In 1937, in Analysis Terminable and Interminable, he wrote that one never finishes with a drive-based demand. In other words, one is never cured. This is evident with Sergei Pankejeff, better known as the Wolf Man, a case Freud describes in 5 lectures on psychoanalysis as having been followed, treated, and cured by him. However, when Pankejeff spoke to a journalist at over 87 years old, he still wasn't doing well and insisted that after all those years he was still suffering. And of course, Freud had never cured him despite claiming otherwise. Every day, except Sundays, Pankejeff went to the Viennese shaman for a 1-hour session for 4 years. His analysis cost him the equivalent of 500,000 euros. That didn't stop Freud, who collected Egyptian antiquities, from suggesting to his patient that he could also offer him a gift, which he did. The same Freud who, on paper, prohibited medication to his patients nevertheless prescribed some to the Wolfman. When Pankejeff's wife committed suicide and he asked to see Freud, Freud refused to receive him. Freud wanted to be rich and famous. He never stopped saying so. He tried everything in terms of therapy to achieve that ambition. Electricity, baths, laying on of hands, cocaine. Even while writing everywhere that psychoanalysis heals and cures, he still prescribed the use of the psychrophore, a urethral probe used to inject ice-cold water into the penis to treat masturbation, a sexual practice he seemed to place above all others for himself. The same year he prescribed this surreal medication, he published 5 lectures on psychoanalysis to praise the effectiveness of his method and his couch. So why this urethral probe? As an intellectual testament, Freud left behind a theory none of his devotees ever acted on. In July 1938, he wrote in his outline of psychoanalysis, "It may be that the future will teach us to influence directly, by means of particular chemical substances, the amount of energy and their distribution in the mental apparatus. Perhaps we shall discover still other therapeutic possibilities, as yet unconceived. Chemistry? Then the unconscious must indeed belong not to metapsychology, but to physiology, unless one wishes to reinvest in another fiction like homeopathy." Psychoanalysis has become such a profitable business that one can understand why such a devastating idea for their trade was never taken up by his little soldiers. Freud revolutionized Western thinking about children. His most shocking theory at the time was that children, too, are sexual beings. Early years are forgotten by most, though they are far more decisive for character and temperament than heredity. What we have forgotten leaves fundamental traces. Were the manifestations of infantile sexuality. Sucking, which is autoerotic. Freud posits that nurses masturbate children to help them fall asleep faster, and that if they do not, the children take matters into their own hands. Likewise, they rock the children. Infants associate their mouth with feeding, which induces the pleasure of fullness after hunger. This area then becomes erogenous. After the oral phase, the child experiences pleasure by stimulating the anal zone. Mastery of bowel movements through contraction or relaxation of the sphincters is another source of pleasure. Releasing feces is seen as offering a gift to the parents. Holding them generates a masturbatory pleasure focused on that zone. After the oral and anal stages, the child enters the genital stage. Little boys masturbate manually, little girls by squeezing their thighs. In 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, 1905, Freud declares that the child is a polymorphous pervert, in other words, capable of eroticizing all areas of the body. Moral inhibitions are not yet in place. Thus, anything is possible, for the child knows neither modesty nor disgust. The psychoanalyst then brings the adult into the child's world by asserting that they maintain a mutual relationship of seduction. The child enjoys showing and looking, seeing and being seen by the adult. Freud develops a specific theory of female sexuality. Upon comparison with boys, girls notice they lack a penis and suffer the effects of this absence. They believe they once had such a member, lost to castration. They then long to recover the lost penis. Young girls thus wish to become little boys. Their erogenous zone is the clitoris, a substitute for the glans. It must cease to be the primary erogenous zone so that libido can be redirected toward the vagina. If this libidinal shift does not occur, hysteria emerges. Children seek mechanical stimulation. They take sexual pleasure in games involving vertigo, rocking, swings, being tossed in the air by adults, the vibrations of train rides. These are the pleasures of autoeroticism. There are also pleasures linked to muscular activity. Fighting, sports, these are sadistic pleasures. Similarly, intellectual activity, which combines concentration and mental focus, brings pleasure. These are cerebral pleasures. Autoerotic, sadistic, or cerebral structures form in moments when a slight trauma may fixate a particular kind of pleasure that becomes decisive in a psyche. Finally, the child reaches the genital stage, which is also that of altruism. Pleasure becomes centered on the sexual organs and aims at union with the opposite sex. If this development is hindered, the individual will become homosexual. Freud indeed considers this modality of sexuality as a halt in the libidinal evolutionary process. He believes that a household lacking a father predisposes one to the genealogy of what he sees as a pathology. Freud also develops a theory of bisexuality, revived in our nihilistic times. There would be no pure masculinity nor pure femininity, but rather masculine and feminine traits unequally distributed within each person. We also know that around the age of 5 or 6, Freud posits the Oedipus complex, which I have already mentioned. This journey makes clear that Freudian theory assumes sexuality is constructed. There is indeed a libido, a sexual energy, but its fixations result from events lived during those crucial early years, which our conscious mind has completely forgotten, but which our unconscious has fully retained. One is therefore not born sadistic or masochistic, or even sadomasochistic, heterosexual or homosexual, narcissistic or altruistic. One becomes so. Inflicting or undergoing pain, even inflicting pain on oneself by inflicting it on others, preferring the opposite sex or one's own, or both, turning one's libido inward or outward. These all result from a personal existential journey. Experiences create a form of determinism from which the subject most often does not break free. The girl is a boy whose sexual development stopped along the way. She longs to become a boy. The boy, shaped by the Oedipus complex, constructs his vision of women based on the model of his mother, and the same goes for girls with their father. Freud is one thing, Freudianism another. For Freud, who defended sexuality framed within a monogamous, faithful, reproductive couple who never believed sexuality should be liberated through unrestrained practices because he preferred a sublimation of these drives into creations, especially aesthetic ones. Freud, then, would have viewed what came to be called Freudo-Marxism with a very disapproving eye, an adulterous parentage that contributed to his reputation. What is Freudo-Marxism? It is an intellectual chimera combining Freud's thought, which claims everything stems from our unconscious, thereby excluding history, with Marx's thought, according to which everything stems from economic production relations, thereby excluding subjectivity. For Freud, history with a capital H has no importance in the psychic development of an individual, which remains ontological. In other words, a matter between the self and the self. For Marx, subjectivity does not exist. It is merely a reflection of the class position one occupies in society. One is either a bourgeois, because one owns the means of production, or a proletarian, because one does not. In short, a sociological matter between society and the self. Freud was indisputably a man of radical right-wing views. One could even say extreme right-wing. He did not treat the poor on the grounds that they would benefit from their illness, notably through social assistance, preferring instead to conduct endless analyses with wealthy clients. He supported Austro-Hungarian and Italian fascist regimes. He wrote a laudatory dedication to Mussolini on the title page of his article Why War? He never wrote a word against National Socialism, but did publish hostile pages on Marxist-Leninism. He delegated one of his own, Ludwig Binswanger, to negotiate with the Nazis in power so that psychoanalysis could continue to exist in the Reich. He ousted from his group Wilhelm Reich, a Jewish and communist psychoanalyst, in the midst of the Nazi turmoil. Yet in an ironic twist of reason, it is precisely Reich who turns out to be the intellectual father of Freudo-Marxism, for whom the unconscious is corporeal and interactive with history. Freudo-Marxism is the second stage of Freud's penetration into France. The first dates back to the early years of the 20th century and followed a literary channel. The pedophile writer André Gide, author of Cordon, 1911 in private form, 1924 for the public edition, explicit on this subject, greatly appreciated Freudianism for a very simple reason. The theory that sees the child as a sexual and sexed being, capable of eroticizing their entire body, a polymorphous pervert eager to seduce adults, legitimized and justified his own sexual practices. Gide, who at the time held significant power at his publisher, successfully persuaded Gaston Gallimard to publish Freud in France through the NRF. The Pope of Surrealism, André Breton, also became enthusiastic, not so much for Freud's pansexualism that encompassed children, but for the theory of dreams and the unconscious. Shaken by the Great War, which he experienced as a doctor, Breton developed surrealism with the aim of destroying reason and method, Judeo-Christian religion, moral order, the supremacy of the West, its philosophy, its art, its metaphysics. To that end, he embraced occultism, magic, parapsychology, spiritualism, African art, imagination, and dreams. What Breton admired in Freud was the idea that the psychic unconscious drives the world. If dreams are, for Freud, the royal road to the unconscious, they become for Breton the royal road to an alternative world. Freud's initial penetration into France thus occurred under the sign of literature, pansexualism, including children's libido for Gide, a new world of imagination, and the dream perspectives for Breton, all of which helped usher in a post-World War I world that World War II would deepen further, nihilism. A number of philosophers are thought to have produced May 68 when in fact they were its products, Foucault, Deleuze, and Guattari. May 68 was an opportunity to spotlight political figures, Marx, Mao, Trotsky, Guevara, Ho Chi Minh, but also philosophical ones, Herbert Marcuse, Henri Lefebvre, and Wilhelm Reich. Reich, as previously mentioned, was the instigator of Freudo-Marxism in Europe. To preserve originality, a philosopher often erases the traces of those who inspired or even plagiarized him. The theses of Freudo-Marxism, as found in Deleuze and Guattari, for instance, are adaptations. What changes is the style, the tone, the way of expressing and saying things. The haze of the era, its taste for sectarianism and its rules, its passion for glossolalia. Reich had written that the unconscious was not metapsychic but energetic. He wanted to go beyond Freud while retaining him, believing that the Oedipus complex was not the ultimate cause of neuroses, but that one had to look for it in the interaction between the subject and society. He thus affirmed the need to articulate sexuality and politics. He claimed that capitalism was deadly because it produced fascism through the repression of sexual instincts. He argued that the liberation of this libidinal energy through fulfilled sexuality would enable the advent of a radiant society. He assigned to the left the task of achieving this libidinal utopia. All of this can be found in Anti-Oedipus, 1972, by Deleuze and Guattari, albeit formulated in the zany vocabulary of someone commenting freely on Reich after having smoked too much and drunk heavily. Reich also advocated a libertarian pedagogy inspired by the early days of the Soviet experiment. He believed that children needed to be taught to liberate their sexuality to avoid the frustrations that build a character armor, which, by constraining the flow of sexual energy, generates neuroses. In Soviet Russia, the authorities suspected sexual experiments involving children. They put an end to it. May 68, as acknowledged even by some of its former participants, produced many delusions. Among them, the fight for pedophilia. Most of the figureheads of the post-68 intellectual left campaign for the decriminalization, thus the justification of sexual relations between adults and children. Gabriel Matzneff wrote the manifesto for this so-called progressive cause under a title that says it all, The Under-16s, 1974. This fascination with children is a pathology of adults who never truly became adults. Just like the necrophile or the zoophile, the pedophile derives pleasure only from the use, an abuse, of a partner who has no say in the matter, the dead, the animal, or the child. The etymology of child, infans, denotes one who does not yet speak. But speaking is more than uttering words. It is understanding what the other says when they speak, and what one says oneself when speaking. Pedophilia is a regressive pathology active in those who killed the father in May 68, with de Gaulle as the scapegoat for the principle of authority, a general and head of state symbolically assassinated in 1969 through his removal from power, who now find themselves like children before the corpse. That Cohn-Bendit, seen as emblematic of the movement, was able to write about his pedophilic experiences in a book, 1975, and later reiterate them verbally, smirking and slouched in his chair on Bernard Pivett's television show Apostrophes, 1982, tells us much about the era. This inability to think of the child as such, in their singularity, is compounded by a paralogism that consists in believing the child is an adult like any other. Yet, for this supposed equality, which reality contradicts as obviously as the nose on one's face, to become visible, it is easier for the adult to become a child than for the child to become an adult. Unfortunately, with a childlike adult as a father, a child never becomes an adult. They remain a child for life. After the death of authority brought about by the barricades of Spring '68, a generation of adults on paper found itself afflicted by the Peter Pan complex. It refused to grow up. The paternal model of old had to be destroyed. The patriarchy had to be ended. The time had not yet come to replace it with a matriarchy, a contemporary obsession, but with infantilization, not feminization as is sometimes claimed. I mentioned earlier an inability to conceive of the child as such. This ineptitude had its doctrinaire figure, namely Françoise Dolto, the mother of the singer Carlos, well known for his flamboyant antics in clothing, speech, advertising, and television. This jovial and seemingly likable man gained fame through songs titled Le Tarlepimpon, Papillou, or Big Bissou, on children's TV shows like Le Club Dorothy, or in farces such as the parody wedding of Thierry Leluron and Coluche, where he appeared as a child wearing a diaper and brandishing a rattle. Who was Françoise Dolto? She claimed to have had an unhappy childhood, despite being pampered with a life of seaside holidays and tennis matches, luxurious vacations in Deauville hotels, obedient parents, and a prolonged youth reminiscent of Tanguy, the young man who refuses to leave the family home where he ruins his parents' lives. When she's not pitying her poor little rich girl youth, she omits, for instance, to mention that she avidly read L'Action Française, Mauras's newspaper, that she underwent a 3-year psychoanalysis from 1934 to 1937 with René Lefort, a man who would later collaborate with the Nazis. Then in 1941, she worked in a mother and child center of the Alexis Carrel Foundation, whose namesake was an eugenicist planning to gas the disabled, and which was funded by the Vichy regime. She would write, of course, in a communist newspaper in 1946, while claiming to be a Trotskyist. After the war, she claimed to have known nothing of the anti-Semitism of the Vichy regime. How could that be possible for a reader of L'Action Française? She even stated that she believed the Vel d'Hiv roundup had been carried out to help Jews escape the Nazi regime. The countless biographies of psychoanalysts available online are whitewashed by the profession, which erases anything that doesn't fit the legend of a progressive, liberating, libertarian psychoanalysis. In short, one that is left-wing. That's why you'll rarely read that this Catholic woman opposed abortion, which she equated with euthanasia, that she opposed its legalization by the Veil Law, or that she supported the idea of family voting, which would allow a couple with 2 children to cast 4 votes, a long-standing demand of fundamentalist Catholic familialists. Françoise Dolto is best known as a psychoanalyst who popularized Freudianism in the media, notably on France Inter in a show whose title came from a line by Hugo, Lorsque l'enfant périt. She later turned it into 2 books, which became bestsellers. For 2 years, she answered questions from listeners, mostly women, using her Freudian toolbox. It was during this period that she developed extravagant theories embraced by a large audience, seduced and misled by her comforting grandmotherly appearance. She was the Mère Dennis of psychoanalysis. According to her, a trauma that had occurred in a united family 2 or more generations earlier could be transmitted through metapsychical unconsciouses to a descendant who would be affected by it. A crime committed in a family 200 years earlier would thus cause suffering in a present-day descendant. Childhood autism could be explained by the mother's unconscious rejection of her child. Sudden infant death syndrome was the fulfillment of the deceased infant's wish to return to the fetal state. In cases of domestic violence, it was the man who needed help, not the woman. Recurring throat infections stemmed from the desire to call someone who doesn't come. Anorexia was presented as a refusal to become a woman. And then this, perhaps the most egregious. The rape of a little girl by her father was, according to her, always a sexual relationship to which the child had consented, a vague patch-up of Freud's seduction theory. This way of exonerating fathers of the crime of pedophilia and blaming the child for not saying no is as murderous as the crime itself. She developed this thesis in a feminist magazine, Choicer La Cause de Femmes, in 1979. What we owe most terribly to this woman is the theoretical legitimization of the child king. In the major stages of childhood, she laid down the categorical imperative of her ethics. A child. Help them be selfish. One trembles to read such a declaration from a woman who had acquired the media status of a psychology guru under the guise of common sense. For the child is naturally selfish and always has been. The role of education is to provide them with the means to overcome this natural selfishness by equipping them with the tools to build a form of cultural empathy. Only then can they envision an adult life. That is, the construction of rational intersubjectivities. To foster the child's natural selfishness is to prevent, in the adult they will become, any mature and responsible relationship. A selfish person cannot build a lasting relationship, found a family, and elevate it, lead a private, intimate, and emotional life, for they become a domestic tyrant in daily life, a potential rapist in bed, and an emotional onanist in everything. Likewise, this narcissistic and egotistical individual will be incapable of solidarity, empathy, brotherhood, sharing, giving, or a generosity. They will prove unfit for any form of community, and therefore for any society, from the smallest, the couple, to the largest, the republic, the state. They will be neither a citizen nor civic-minded, but an exploiter and a cynic. In a relationship, their concern will be, what use is this to me? In the presence of an individual, how can they be useful to me? Faced with a weak person, how to destroy them? With a strong person, how to seduce or manipulate them? With their partner, do they flatter or enhance my narcissism? Regarding the state, what can I extort from it? This egotist demands every right and acknowledges no duty. Everything is owed to them, and they owe nothing to anyone. They take but never give. They demand but want to be left alone. They help themselves but never help others. The worst part of this pedagogy is that it wasn't confined to a few bohemian households. It became state pedagogy. It didn't just wreak havoc in families, it devastated society, and thus civilization. After May 68, the schoolteacher who represented order and authority, who often ruled with terror and an iron discipline not excluding corporal punishment, who was recognized in the village as an authority on par with the priest, the vet, or the mayor. This schoolteacher, trained in normal schools, was replaced by what became the schoolteacher professor molded in the University Institutes for Teacher Training, IUFM. The person once called sir was now addressed by their first name, once spoken of formally, now informally, once feared, now befriended. At the same time as syllabic reading methods, dates and chronology, essays, dictations and questions, multiplication tables and mental arithmetic were abandoned in favor of the global method, closed tests and self-dictations, and learning how to use calculators. Politeness and courtesy were also discarded. Those manners inherent to any unequal relationship in which it was accepted that the adult knows and the child does not, and that the pedagogical relationship was meant to transmit knowledge to someone who lacked it. It was declared ex cathedra by inspectors, freshly graduated in the so-called science of education, that children had as much, if not more, to teach teachers as the reverse. Dolto was the high priestess of this drift. She no longer saw school as ill-suited to the student, but to the learner. Its curricula were obsolete, its teachers unfit because they were ignorant of Freudian mysticism. What did her catechism look like? Any teacher who wishes to transmit content to a child is pushing them away, traumatizing, brutalizing them. If they demand punctuality, it's to impose their omnipotence, because they seek only to crush subjectivities. If they address the entire class the same way, says Dolto, who had private tutors at home, it's because they want to produce a herd of pannered sheep. If they teach difficult, austere, demanding material, it's because this bore hasn't understood that learning must be joyful and pleasurable. If they've chosen the order of subjects in the day, it's simply to impose their law, whereas timetables and content should be free. If they stand on a platform, it's because that place is the seat of the castrator. And then this peak of intellectual destitution and denial. If a child is failing at school, it's because no one has realized they're actually gifted. Quasimodo, is Einstein unrecognized? In A Cause of Children, Dolto writes, the main flaw of public education is that it's mandatory. What is mandatory takes on the nature of forced labor. The penal colony still exists in people's minds. A step further, put in the language of your average 68 who saw SS officers everywhere. It becomes, every teacher is a fascist. To which one might add, every student in their hands is a victim of that fascism. If school is a penal colony, a concentration camp, a gulag, then freedom means allowing the child to become the center of the world, doing whatever they please. This was heard as a progressive horizon when it was, in fact, a regressive invitation. In 50 years, this pedagogy has had time to bear fruit. It has formatted one or two generations. The child kings thus spawned are now old enough to be parents and to help steer the country, if not become president of the republic. The hallmark of the child king is a narcissistic, egotistical, egocentric, if not autistic, personality in the secondary sense of the dictionary definition, which allows us to extrapolate the harmful pathology into a structural inability to maintain relationships with others. He is also distinguished by an intolerance to frustration. He cannot bear when someone resists his whims. In a candy store, he wants all the sweets at once and throws a tantrum when they're refused, even if he's already been given a well-filled bag. He is narcissistic, believes the world begins and ends with him. Outside of his ego, nothing exists. The universe revolves around his self. He has buddies, online friends, pals. He thinks he has friends because his account tells him so, but he has no idea what bound Montaigne and La Boétie. Thus we see that, in his Viennese office on 19th Bergasse, Freud pulled the pin from a grenade which threw Freudo-Marxist Wilhelm Reich, but also the pedophile Gide in league with the NRF, the fan of turning tables André Breton and his surrealist friends, the May 68 activists blinded by the fire they started, and the kneeling before the Freudian Pythia that was François Dolto. This pulling of the pin, then, led to a terrible explosion. In May, therefore, the father was killed. The aim was to do away with de Gaulle and all figures of authority, as long as they were masculine or paternal. The schoolteacher, the priest, the boss, the professor, the husband, the leader, the foreman, the executive, the mayor, left standing on the barricades was a fatherless son, in other words, a child. That Greta Thunberg should hold such aura in the Western world. I dare say outside the metropolises no one pays her sermons much mind, whether on the high plateaus of Eritrea or the mountains of Tibet, in the forests of Papua New Guinea or the Biafran Desert, or even in Chambois, my native village in the Oran Department. Such fascination can only be understood in light of the infantilization of our society. Just as the child who was once a radiant and powerful adult eventually becomes an old man drained of energy in a nursing home, a civilization also undergoes such growths and declines, such powers and senescences. The Old Testament foretold it. Woe to the land whose king was a servant. Ecclesiastes 10 verse 16. And here we are, having become too frail and fragile, adults, exhausted, rest by becoming children again. Like their civilization, they obey this tropism that shrinks them, stunts them, curls them inward, diminishes them, retracts them, shortens them, like fabric washed at the wrong temperature. Alan Souchon's song Allo Maman Bobo, 1977, not by chance, turns out to be programmatic. I'm not doing well as a tough guy, he complains to his mother. The hero of those years is thus the man who returns to his mother's skirts because the world is too cruel, and he proves incapable of behaving like an adult in it. The era of Jean Gabin and Lino Ventura is over. That was also the era of General de Gaulle. Now comes the age of moaning and whining. So what then is Greta Thunberg's magisterium? I'll set aside the content of her speeches, to which I will dedicate another letter, and linger instead on the rhetoric, which is not that of genealogy. You now know what that entails. What are all the causes of climate change? And not just the ones isolated by the IPCC, but that of moraline. Greta Thunberg berates adults. She cries, she screams, she grimaces, she insults, she lays guilt on them. She puts them on notice. She turns her youth into an argument. Young people, preferably girls, know what science is, as she puts it, always emphasizing the word with a fashionable air quotes gesture. Old people, on the other hand, preferably white men, are selfish, evil, detestable, execrable. Every morning they exterminate a new animal species, engage in large-scale deforestation, emit greenhouse gases, and do everything possible to trigger tsunamis. She rose to fame by skipping school. Françoise Dolto would have loved it, as she believed teachers could only play a tyrannical role. Why bother learning anything at all when, at 16, one already knows everything? Why carry a school bag and sit in a classroom where an adult teaches life and earth sciences when reading a summary of the IPCC report, provided by one's well-meaning parents and friends, is enough to speak on behalf of science? Science? Yes, science. That is to say mathematics, geometry, logic, astronomy, geography, geology, statistics, geomorphology, climatology, topography, physics, biology, astrophysics, chemistry, cosmology, medicine, demography, and of course epistemology, the science of how science is constituted, all of which, naturally, one has mastered at 16, especially since one no longer attends school. To claim that when one speaks, one is science, one must, let's stay modern, master general and special relativity, fractal logic, chromatic geography, quantum physics, plate tectonics, multiverse astrophysics, functional analysis, non-commutative geometry, soil morphogenesis, geodesic methodology, etc. Otherwise, one is not science, does not speak for science, air quotes, and ought to proceed with greater humility. But humility is the last of GT's virtues. She scolds French MPs who receive her at the Palais Bourbon and applaud the dressing down she gives them. She lambasts heads of state to their faces at the United Nations in a speech that runs well past her allotted time, without being interrupted. She urges the Pope, who receives her in private audience, to join her cause. She files complaints against ecocidal countries, including France, but not China, alongside a group of children, the youngest of whom is 8 years old. Politically correct journalists roll out the red or green carpet for her and justify her mother's claim that, endowed with a magical power, she can see CO2 with the naked eye where it exists, even though it is, by definition, a colorless and invisible gas. Seeing a gas ought to land in the disinformation column of mainstream newspapers, but it's in these very pages that journalists claim she said it without saying it, while saying it, but not the way climate realists, whom they label climate skeptics, say she said it. So here we have a 16-year-old girl, no longer in school, who claims, as she scolds and fumes, rants and threatens, that she is science, before whom some of the most powerful adults in the world kneel and ask forgiveness. Even the Pope himself, never stingy with moralizing, being Jesuit through and through, issues a global message thanking her for her struggle. Who will say that the West has become an empire whose princess is an autistic, unschooled teenage girl? One may mention her behavioral disorder, but only if it helps ascend yet another rung on the compassion scale of political correctness. One must not mention it merely as a factual note, like saying she wears braids. Reality must not intrude where magical thinking and postmodern shamans reign. Let us stop here with Greta Thunberg. But let us still ask, how is this child able to dictate the law to adults, and in such a threatening and authoritarian tone? Adults who adopt submissive postures, offer apologies, beg forgiveness, assure they understand, and promise, in shame, not to do it again, except for a few global heads of state who are firmly determined not to let a child tell them what to do. I am thinking of a recent former president of the United States and the presidents of Russia and Brazil. And yet, Greta Thunberg revives everything May 68 tried to burn: authoritarian speech, the use of threats, scolding in a firm tone, stern reprimands, blame, and reproach. All the things now forbidden to a teacher addressing a student in a rural classroom, Greta Thunberg can use against the Pope, heads of state at the UN, national lawmakers and their presidents, journalists and their editors-in-chief, even entire countries she punishes by suing them. And they, struck with anathema, beat their breasts and confess, like in China during the Cultural Revolution, that they deserve the blows. An inversion of values and a masochistic drift, hallmarks of collapsing civilizations. Good is evil and evil is good, said the sycophant of the Marquis de Sade. Butterly, Klossowski, Foucault, Lacan, Deleuze, Barthes, Salers. Normal is pathological, and pathological is normal, proclaimed Georges Canguilhem, physician and philosopher, who had Deleuze and Foucault as zealous disciples. The man was also, indeed, an inspector general, which helps with one's career. Sade would have delighted in an autistic girl obtaining the Pope's assent to her perception of reality. As for masochism, pleasure in abjection and suffering, ecstasy in evil and death, delectation in blood in excrement. It is precisely the appropriate pathology for a civilization entering its terminal stage. A child drawing Western blood and the West begging her forgiveness. Such is the natural order of things when nihilism rules. A few words in conclusion on this return to childhood, this regression of adults incapable of leaving their infantile state. What do these big boys raised as child kings look like? They suckle, like an infant at its mother's breast. They nuzzle a water bottle that follows them like a comfort blanket. Or, more stylishly, they might do the same with an eco-friendly flask like Greta. Suckling also applies to old-school cigarette smokers, sometimes rolling their own, or to vapors who prefer getting their nicotine fix through a modern technological device. If they can afford fine dining restaurants, they are offered with great pomp things to suck, slurp, sip, lick, nuzzle, or suckle. Hence the success in French cuisine of deconstructions, espumas, foams, mousses, jellies, decoctions, tisanes, infusions, broths. Teeth or dentures are no longer necessary for eating. Roasted marshmallow has replaced wild boar pate. They never go anywhere without their transitional object, part pillow corner, part teddy bear, their smartphone. Their eyes are fixed on the screen and their fingers on the keyboard as much as possible, especially in the presence of others. This object allows them to abolish reality in favor of a virtual world tailored to their whims. They are physically with a flesh and blood being, or several, but they prefer a pixelated one, a digital image. No wonder, then, that from pornographic films, the leading cause of global internet traffic, to sexual encounters with hyper-realistic silicone dolls, they build a world that obeys their every whim. I take, I consume, I discard, I skip. No need even to speak. The dematerialization of the world allows them to rebuild another according to their whims. They live happily, but in a world that does not exist. This intoxication with virtuality allows them to amass friends they have never met and never will. These digital friends contribute to the narcissism of account holders by their sheer number, the reign of quantity over quality. They prefer these immaterial creatures to the living beings right next to them. The eroticization of this digital fetish displaces eros into the terrain of a virtual world very much controlled in reality by the GAFAM bosses. Turning away from the real world in favor of the virtual allows the deep state's managers to lead lives onto the path of consumption. A consumption that caters to the narcissistic needs created by that world. Thus, anything that satisfies the vertigo of the child being rocked or swinging, or as Freud would say, masturbating. Surfing, windsurfing, skateboarding, formerly rollerboarding, rollerblading, formerly roller skating, the scooter, the electric bike, formerly the Solex, the climbing wall, essentially a mini resin mountain installed in a multipurpose hall. The mountain bike, MTB. References abound. In man, playing games, Kalois identified ilinx or vertigo as one of the components of games, along with alia, chance, agon, competition, and mimicry, imitation. One cannot deny that one of the hallmarks of adults raised as child kings is their addiction to games. Video games at home, buried in the couch, and also portable games on that famous transitional object, the smartphone. The pacifier with the vapor, the dizziness with the scooter, the virtualization of the world with the smartphone, the escape from that same world through games, the portrait begins to take shape. Let us continue. The impossible adult also sports tattoos like prehistoric men, indigenous peoples, or in the past, bad boys. Young men who believe that by following fashion they're expressing their individuality can thus display Maori-style tattoos on their legs, which justifies wearing shorts, a variation on the theme of short pants, or on their arms, which legitimizes the tank top, ensuring no one misses it. While in Polynesian society, the tattoo indicates one's place in the tribal hierarchy. In nihilist society, it means nothing other than the desire to belong to the herd while believing this is precisely how one escapes it. When women partake in this herd practice, they may get their husband's name tattooed, not imagining that, sociologically speaking, he may one day no longer be the same, or their children's names, in case, suffering from Alzheimer's, they might forget them. They may also tattoo a date in Roman numerals to showcase a highly memorable moment in their rich lives: loss of virginity, wedding, first child. Latin, especially among those who never studied it, or Gothic script, preferably among those who don't know German, and also Chinese or Japanese characters, particularly among those whose vocabulary was limited to sushi or sake, are all very fashionable. The tattooed person is often a polyglot, but only for one word or a short phrase. In most cases, the tattoo is ink inscribed into the skin as a way of exhibiting to others the idea one has of oneself, or would like others to have. I once saw, on the forearm of a young man who feigned the virility he lacked, a tattoo in Gothic letters of a Latin sentence about time that would have worked wonders in his philosophy exam. It is also sometimes a frank confession of who one is. I have seen, on people who were themselves incomplete, tattoos equally unfinished and awaiting an improbable continuation, or on a young woman with a shattered psyche, the girlfriend of the previous one, tattoos scattered all over her body with neither rhyme nor reason. Moreover, this regressive world speaks French increasingly poorly and readily uses baby talk. Socialist President François Hollande did much to popularize this linguistic regression with phrases like, "France, she is great. My project, it is socialist." Journalists say, "The president, he said," etc. Adults speaking in public say "my daddy" or "my mommy," unable to say "my father" or "my mother." Let's leave it there. A collapsing civilization experiences a moment of senescence akin to a return to childhood. It is not uncommon to hear of elderly people crying out "mother" in their delirium. Likewise, many accounts tell of First World War soldiers who, in their final moments, seem to close the loop of their existence by returning to their earliest years. In these regressive times, anything reminiscent of the adult world is reviled. Any figure of authority or order is detested, and anything that might resemble punishment, from fines to imprisonment, including reprimands or even simple remarks, is contested. It is the reflex of the child who wants everything immediately, and if denied, whines, squeals, screams, cries. Our era, full of moraline, is also saturated with sniveling. The child-turned-prince seals the triumph of the third sex that pedophiles claim to seek. The boy is not a man, the girl is not a woman, and androgyny reigns in an indeterminacy where the abolition of the sexes is presented as a civilizational ideal. In her time, the feminist Elizabeth Badinter praised this androgyny in a programmatically titled work The One is the Other, 1986, followed by XY, on Male Identity, 1994. She believed that to end the war between the sexes, one had to do away with the sexes themselves. It apparently never occurred to her that perhaps it would be more reasonable to condemn war rather than the sexes in order to achieve the same result.